self-observation for insight. I'm going to talk to you about how to actually learn productive things about yourself, about your identity, about who you are from some of this tracking. And I want to start out talking about what self-observation, actually, my experience basically comes from interviewing a ton of people and teaching courses at NYU my name is Quinn Norton. Thank you. And a lifetime of occasionally healthy self-obsession. And I want to talk a little bit about what self-tracking isn't before we get back into what it is. This is not going to give you enlightenment. This is, the human condition is one of being wells of infinite sorrow and isolation, continually trying to reach out and make true connections with each other. And your Fitbit's not going to change that. We are not anywhere near being able to truly track the human condition. We're not doing science. We're doing sciencey things to ourselves, but we don't have a baseline that makes sense. So it's more like this. It's more like building cairns. It's more like a disciplined practice. It's a place to find small insights and hope that they add up to occasional mighty leverage points. It's an admission of self-dissatisfaction. We do have to admit that we are not pleased with who we are. Success in this is predicated more than anything else on starting with a good question. And this is some of my guides to figuring out the good question are talking to people about it, trying to clarify your language, trying to figure out what you're talking about. Look for vague words and stamp them out of existence. I feel anxious. Well, people mean a lot of different things by anxious. What do you mean by it? Is it something you feel in your body? Is it a paranoia you feel socially? So destroy your vague language, and your results are only ever going to be as good as your question. And I want to introduce an idea called the theory of change real quick. It actually comes out of the NGO circles, and the theory of change versus the theory of action. We're very much in the theory of action mode right now, partly that's the technology we have, which is what can I do? I can track my heart rate. I can look at my sleep, right? The theory of change says, what do I want to have happen? And what's the next thing down that needs to happen to make that happen? And then what's the next thing you do? And you keep working backwards from that goal until you hit your theory of action. And then that describes a path by which you can accomplish that thing. Sometimes that's really, really hard, but it doesn't get easier if you ignore that fact. One of the things that I discovered, especially with my students, is that you always, always, always need to combine the subjective and the quantitative. Either on their own doesn't work. You need to journal your subjective experience against that data. You need that to contextualize the data. And frankly, all you actually care about is the subjective experience. We gather a lot of data, but actually the subjective experience is what you are living. If you are not monitoring something about your mood or your quality of life or something like that, you're not going to do anything interesting with that data in the long run. Not to yourself. And I want to speak about the paradox of self-observation. You will never know the unobserved you. Give up. We're just stuck in that state. Even with maximal automation, you know that you're being surveilled by your future self. That bastard. And that surveillance changes your behavior. The time that you spend monitoring yourself is behavior that you wouldn't spend doing something else. All of these things change the condition. And you realize that the moment you stop doing any of those things, you pass into the unknown again. So check your data as you go along. Is it meaningful? Is what you're doing, does it seem meaningful to you? Is what you're doing doable? Are you spending too much time on it? Bounce it off other people. You'll notice this, I'm saying a lot in this, bounce things off other people. I like the drama in Zio because sleep and drama are often linked. This is one of the most important things, which is why it almost doesn't fit on the slide. Let your data be honest to you. Prepare yourself for negative results. Most of the time, you will get negative results. And try different things. If you feel like you have an idea, try to falsify it. Fight yourself on it. Try and figure out the story that the data itself is telling you. Because if you can assimilate that, if you can start to kind of like accept your negative consequences, then it prepares you for serendipity. And I'll give a personal example. I did 5 glucose sticks a day for 5 weeks, and I did that against mood and hunger and energy level and found nothing. No correlation whatsoever. However, I happened to do it against my iCal calendar, and I found out that if I was down, the one thing that would consistently lift me every time was social contact with weak ties. So at that point, I have a completely different set of data that emerges from this. This is something that has remained true. This is something I now have as a toolbox, in my toolbox. Now, my last step, and this is going to be, I suspect, your least favorite, is burn your notebooks. Where's this page? When it's time to act on your data, stop looking at your data. If you need a doctor or a psychologist or a rabbi or a pet cat or a houseplant or a guru or a 12-step program or a gym membership or divorce or more sleep, put down the gadgets and the notebooks and go get that. Ultimately, this is actually a narcissistic, self-obsessed, masturbatory, inconsiderate thing that we're doing, and we have to pass through that phase. But we justify that when we do the burn, we step through that, and we do the needful. We have to put down the data. Now, I figure you don't have to burn your notebooks if you're actually disciplined enough not to look at them. I'm not. In the end, this is a masturbatory waste of time if you don't stop and do the needful. And that's pretty much it. So.
Thank you for that talk. You know, I have to ask you the questions that are in the tradition of QS, especially because you mentioned such an interesting self-tracking project that you did with 5 glucose sticks a day and struggling through your data and coming to a really kind of interesting conclusion. I think there's a whole talk in that, you know, and what our discipline here is to say, you know, what did you do, how did you do it, and what did you learn? And I just would love it if you would take some time, take a few minutes, and tell us about that self-tracking project that you did, how you did it, what you struggled with, and what you learned.
Glucose monitors are annoyingly difficult to test. It's good
You mean calibrate?
Yeah, calibrate. It's good to hold your hand down. The side of the thumb is good. I got a lot of tips from a type 1 diabetic friend of mine. I learned that my blood sugar actually varies quite a bit, and it doesn't map to anything. It just, my subjective experience didn't really, you know, I went through and I just kept looking for something, and I would be hungry at high and like energetic at low.
So how were you tracking the correlates?
I was taking these, essentially I would record all my meals. I would take the finger sticks, usually around meal times, but not, I wasn't doing 5 meals a day. And then I would record these factors. And what I actually recommend to my students to do as well is I used a relative scale to me. So when it came to hunger, energy, and mood, I just used a 1 to 5 scale, just to give me something that was relative to itself over time. And the nice thing, one of the reasons I really like 1 to 5 scales is because they're incredibly quick. You can do them a bunch of times. You don't end up, you end up with something that you can see changing over time, but you don't end up with too much to do. Actually, I want to bounce to a story of one of my students real quick because
Don't go too fast though, because this is valuable. I mean, this is like getting people to describe what they've actually done.
Right.
That's the gold. You know, so just a couple of things. How many things did you track associated with your blood sugar?
I tracked a macronutrient, roughly. I did not track my sleep during this time, and I tracked mood factors, and I ended up accidentally, serendipitously, tracking them against my social calendar. And that covers it.
And then when you said you couldn't find anything,
right.
How were you? Tell us about your process of analyzing the data.
I was looking at these. I was looking at the numbers, and I did some graphing. This was years ago, so I did some graphing against just by hand. You know, I occasionally I was just like, this isn't enough data for me to bother with going programmatically on it. I plotted everything by hand, and then I plotted those numbers relative to each other because they were similar scale, and it's all noise.
And then just finally, how did you learn that your contact with weak social ties caused your blood glucose to spike?
No. It caused my mood to elevate. Whenever my mood was down, contact with weak social ties would elevate my mood. Yes?
So that was you had the serendipity there, you had the data, you weren't expecting to even look at that correlation. What was your original motivation? Why did you prick your finger with it? Why did you do this thing? Right? What did you
so two things is one is I do a lot of weird shit with my body.
So it was.
But the other thing is like I wanted to know if it had a relationship with mood. I wanted to know if it had a relationship with how tired I was, and I have a lot of hunger, and that seemed logical. I actually had hunger a little bit later. When you talk about I want to kind of like re-answer your question, Gary, real quick with this one thing my student did. For her midterm, she was trying to resolve mood stuff, anxiety and being down, and she mapped a lot of factors. I actually don't want to get into the specifics of that part of it because what she did next was more interesting. And she did her midterm presentation, and she showed all this data of the things that she had found. And it came time for the conclusion, and her conclusion was to turn to the class and say, I don't have very many good days. For the final, she said she picked out 5 activities and that made her happy, and required herself to do them every day. She watched a movie every day. She called friends within a certain circle every day. She did yoga every day. She ate something every day. I'm going to forget that one. But anyway, she did these 5 activities every day. So when she presented for the final, was that she fixed it. She was happy by the time she got to the final.
Quinn, in fact, I was going to ask you, because you taught this class just this last year.
Yeah.
What were the kind of sort of projects that your students did?
An amazing range. I was absolutely thrilled with my class. One student had been a meditator for about 10 years, and he went ahead and stopped to create a new baseline. I didn't manage to get in here, but my God, baselines, they help. So he stopped to create a new baseline. He measured that against his mood and those sorts of factors, but he also measured against his ability to perceive pitch and memory and ability to recall short strings of numbers. So he mapped that against his non-meditating condition, resumed meditation, and saw pretty much the expected rise in his ability to do these things that you get out of meditation. It's fairly robust literature. But still, stepping through it himself was a remarkable thing. Coming back to the question of the question, I had another student who came to me and was trying to figure out what to do about having problems with attention. And he'd been diagnosed ADD. And as we were kind of going back and forth and talking about it, it came up that his problem with this whole thing was that he had just gone into grad school and he had a lot of books to read, and he was never very good at reading long books, and he was terrified that he was going to flunk out of grad school because he couldn't read all these books. So I said, here's your question. This is your question. Figure out how you're reading, not whether or not you have ADD. So what he ended up doing was, if you know this story, was under 4 different conditions doing 10-minute films of him reading books. The first condition was a control condition. The second was on caffeine, and the third was Adderall week 1, and the fourth was Adderall week 2. And then he took it and tiled it into a YouTube video. And just you could see, but he had a fairly robust data set about like having managed to signal until he got distracted under these different conditions. But you didn't actually need the data, because you could look at that tile and see dramatic differences between the different conditions. He ended basically writing a love note to Adderall after that. But we'll see how that works out in the long run. Anyway, yes.
Why do you say this is not science?
I say this is not science because what you're trying to do is study yourself and not trying to make something generalizable. And I feel like one of the reasons I try—
That doesn't separate it from science.
One of the reasons I try to separate it out from science is because there's an awful lot of baggage people have about that. And I feel like if you feel that you're doing science, there are tools you won't pick up and use.
Well, maybe you won't, but that doesn't make it. So
There are
in
tools
other
many
words,
people
not call
won't
it
pick up and
science
use.
because it might change your behavior. It's still science.
There are many tools people won't, not just me, there are many tools that people I have to talk to won't pick up and use if they think that they're required to do science.
Okay, well, that doesn't mean it's not science, though.
I think, at that point we can, white courtesy fund for Wittgenstein, but
I don't know what that means.
then we're arguing about, the nature of language.
So
No, we're not. Science, I mean,
let's thanks Quinn and again,